He is also the co-founder and chairman of Sunicom. It's a leading economic firm here, based here in Washington. And in his career, he was the Undersecretary of Commerce from 1997 to 2001. And he was also advisor to President Clinton in 1991 and 92 during President Clinton's run for the presidency. I look forward to your comments.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to salute the Carbon Tech Center for its work, and it's an honor to be on this panel. We're all kind of old hands at this, I guess you could tell. My first conversation about this, I think, was in 1989 when I was helping then Senator Gore with environmental economics as he was writing Earth on the Balance. And at that time, this notion, the notion of a tax shift and a carbon tax, the notion that you had to take seriously the implications of the use of fossil fuels for the stability of the world's climate was kind of an eccentric position. I think the best news that we all have is that we now have a real consensus, a public consensus, indeed an international consensus, that we have to take serious action to address climate change. Indeed, I think it's probably, and this is, I'm an economist wading into climate science, which is a dangerous thing, but I am told at least that the problem, as Dr. Hansen suggested, is more urgent than is publicly understood. For example, we normally try to measure this by looking at the current quantity of CO2 in the atmosphere versus what we think are the lower and upper bounds of concentrations which would trigger irreversible changes in the climate. And we say that there are currently 375 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. The lower bound is 450. The upper bound is 550. So 375 is equal to 83% of the lower bound or 69% of the upper bound. But that doesn't count the other greenhouse gases. And climate scientists can make an equivalency so that you have CO2 equivalents. And taking the concentrations of the other greenhouse gases and making that computation for CO2 equivalents, we find that we are already at 92% of the lower bound and 75% of the upper bound. So this problem, indeed, it's a good thing we are reaching consensus to take action because action is urgent. Given that, the question becomes, what are the particular implications of the different approaches to addressing climate change? We've heard a lot about carbon-based taxes today. I write a lot about it as well. But I've been asked to kind of be the skunk at the Tea Party and focus more on the disadvantages of cap and trade. Let me say, I think we only get one shot at this. I think whatever system we put in place, we're going to be stuck with for some time. And if it fails, it would be very difficult, I think, to come back again politically. I don't have any ideological problem with cap and trade. As an economist, I prefer carbon-based taxes for all the reasons that my colleagues have laid out. My real problem with cap and trade is I think it will fail. And if it fails, we will find ourselves in very serious circumstances indeed. The fundamental economic difference, and this has been alluded to, but I want to try to expand it. So for the non-economists of the world, which is, of course, 99.9% of us, between cap and trade and and a carbon-based tax system is that cap and trade is what economists call a quantity-based regime as opposed to a price-based regime. Now, the quantity-based regime, that is, you set a cap, that's the strength of cap and trade because it can deliver a known reduction or claims to be able to deliver a known reduction in emissions each year. That is, wherever the cap happens to be. The problem is that demand for the energy, which produces the greenhouse gases, is not easily predictable. And what happens when the demand is different from the demand which was assumed when you set the cap? So what happens if the winter is colder than expected, or the summer is hotter than expected, or economic growth is greater than expected? Well, what happens is the demand for energy goes up. It hits a cap, which was set based on an assumption of a warmer winter, cooler summer, slightly less growth. And with any quantity-based regime, scarcity sets in at a very rapid rate, and the price for the permits goes up very sharply. And this is not a possible outcome. This is an inevitable outcome most years. What's wrong with it? What's wrong with that price volatility in the permits? Well, if you are allocating permits for all forms of energy, the change in the price of the permits will be transmitted to the change in the underlying energy. And so you get significant national volatility in energy prices on top of the international volatility in energy prices which we already experienced based on global supply and demand. Well, how great a problem is this? Well, we looked at this. We have a successful cap and trade program, and that's the acid rain program. And the price of its permits, of the SO2 permits, since the program was put in place in the early 90s, has risen or fallen by an average of 43% a year. That's very substantial price volatility. Indeed, in the last 3 years, it rose and fell at an average of 80% a year. We also have the first years of the European trading scheme, the Kyoto-based cap and trade system of the major nations in Europe. And in the first year and a half, the price shifts in the permits under the Kyoto scheme have risen or fallen by an average of 17.5% a month. Volatility is an abstract concept. Adding on top of the ups and downs in energy prices that we experience from the international market, and which will only get worse in the sense that we believe that there's that demand will continue to outstrip the growth in supply in energy markets. We are talking about very, very volatile energy prices. And there is the economic problem, which is, as Professor Metcalf said, that businesses need to be able to have some sense of the price of energy when they're trying to determine whether to invest in more energy efficient technologies or more climate friendly technologies. And so economists worry that it will reduce business investment, particularly in this area. But there's another problem. It will reduce political support for the whole regime. The American public doesn't tolerate that kind of volatility in energy prices. And so the real issue to me, from the point of view of climate change, as an economist, the real issue is business investment. As someone who has spent many years concerned about this issue, the real issue is that I think political support for the entire effort could crumble in the face of this kind of volatility. Moreover, this would be a much greater problem for the United States, or a particular problem for the United States as compared to Europe or Japan, because our economy is much more energy intensive, which is to say less energy efficient. And so this volatility will have a greater effect on our economy and our households than in other countries. Um, as opposed to a quantity-based regime, a carbon-based tax is a price-based regime. And the negative of that, let's acknowledge the negative, it doesn't have a cap. So we cannot know for certain, year to year, how much a particular carbon-based tax would reduce emissions. Again, because we can't predict demand. And so we don't get a known quantity reduction in emissions. Although I would argue that politically we won't get it with cap and trade either, because the public won't stand for that kind of price volatility when it begins to hit the cap. But it adds a known increment to the price of energy, a carbon-based tax, based on its carbon content. It changes the relative prices of different forms of energy and the relative prices of different products and services that depend upon energy, based upon the kind of energy that the production process uses or that you consume. That is exactly the price signal you want. And it is a known addition to the price, and so business can take this into account in making its investment decisions, in particular in making its investment decisions in converting to more energy efficient technologies and alternative fuels. And in particular, it provides a constant known incentive to develop and shift to climate-friendly technologies, and which is also comparable from country to country in a global carbon-based tax system. And if the climate scientists are right about the urgency of this problem, I think I agree with my colleague, Professor Metcalf, and Dr. Hansen, that neither a carbon-based tax nor a cap and trade is going to be enough, particularly one at a level that would be politically tolerable, is going to be enough to solve this problem. We need technological advance. We don't have the time to do this. Oh, sorry. We need technological advance, which means we need strong incentives for that technological advance. We have the state of technology that current market prices for energy based on carbon content produces. We live in a market society. We have those price signals. They're clearly not sufficient. In my view, we need not only strong incentives through changing relative prices through a carbon-based tax system, I think we also need to provide additional incentives for the development and the deployment of these technologies. The problem is not only the development, the problem is also the cost of deploying them across the economy and across households. This was an issue the Stern Commission in England focused on particularly, and I think did a particularly good job. Everybody has their own model of a tax shift. We modeled a carbon-based tax starting at $14 per ton of CO2 and rising to $50 per ton of CO2 over 20 years. We were looking at the macroeconomic implications of imposing that tax and returning the tax in either payroll tax reductions or lump sum payments to households. For all the reasons outlined, we also favor lump sum payments to households. It's more progressive. It doesn't touch the Social Security system, and it helps people who don't work. And we found, incidentally, that the 20 years out GDP was $22.3 trillion under this system. That's in 2005 dollars, as compared to 22.5 trillion if we did nothing at all. It had a trivial effect on overall growth and average incomes, and we sequestered 10% of those revenues for to promote the development and deployment of climate-friendly technologies, because I think that the price signals in a carbon-based tax system or in a cap-and-trade system will not be sufficient, or may not be sufficient. We don't know. The pace of technological advance is, by its nature, impossible to predict. given the urgency of this issue, given what is at stake in addressing it effectively, I considered the subsidies a necessary piece of insurance. So beyond the question of volatility, there's also the question of, and this is, I think, a very important aspect of this problem, of how transparent the systems are and how easy they are to manipulate through the political process. One of the advantages of a carbon-based tax is that it's absolutely transparent. Everybody knows what the tax is. It's under public debate and public scrutiny. One of the problems with cap and trade in that respect is that the caps are set based on some relationship to previous emissions. So a cap will be set at 8% less than the emissions in some base year. This is the model of the Kyoto Protocol. And we can see how easy it was to game the Kyoto Protocol, which is why the Kyoto Protocol, when applied in Europe, has had no effect at all, no discernible effect on emissions. In 1997, when the debate about the base year for cap and trade for the Kyoto Protocol was being resolved, they chose 1990 as the base year. Why 1990? Well, it happens 1990, they needed to get Russia on board in order to get enough votes to Russia and the Eastern European countries, in order to get enough votes to reach a consensus on the Kyoto Protocols. Well, 1990 happened to be the last year of the Soviet Union. And with the fall of the Soviet Union, enormous amounts of wildly inefficient state-supported industrial enterprises across Russia, across Eastern Europe were closed down. And so, as a consequence, the emissions in all these countries fell sharply, because all these inefficient plants that had only survived with enormous subsidies could no longer be sustained. No one wanted to run them because they all lost money. The result, and it was not just Russia and the Eastern European countries, Germany by then had unified. And so Germany got the benefit of East Germany's elevated base year. In 1995, Britain had privatized the coal industry. And as a consequence, the price went up and consumption of coal in Britain went down. For all these reasons, and France, of course, a largely nuclear energy nation, was going to be little affected by the Kyoto Protocols. The result is that virtually all the players were exempt from having to make any real reductions. And indeed, the system looked like and was a bonanza for Russia, who would have enormous excess permits based upon emissions that were figured from a time when the economy was operating in an entirely different way. Now, the particular corruption of I don't mean that in a financial sense, but the particular political corruption of the Kyoto process, which produced a system which said also, of course, that all developing countries were exempt from all requirements, which produced a system in which virtually no country had any real pressure to reduce emissions, produced an illusion of action without real action, since Germany had no compunction, France had no compunction, Britain had no compunction, Russia had no compunction, China had none, India had none, Latin America had none. Well, there were actually only 4 countries that had real constraints. It was the United States, Canada, Australia, and Japan. The United States and Australia said, hey, we're the only ones paying the price. We're out of here. And Japan and Canada reinterpreted the rules, which has continued to go on. I mean, most recently, Germany exempted all of her new coal-firing plants. The point is that in this kind of complicated system is incredibly easy to game, and very vulnerable to the normal interest group pressures which drive the best democracies. Now let's imagine the interest group pressures in a place like Russia or Iran or China, for that matter, which are not transparent systems, which are systems in which government preferences are routinely given out based on political or personal relationships. And you can see how difficult it is to administer this kind of system in a way which will produce the desired result. Look, one form of corruption versus another in Russia is not really our concern. Our concern is that the system won't work, that we will commit ourselves to an approach which it will take us at least a decade to recognize and unravel, and then leave the world and the American people in particular very skeptical of the government's ability to do anything in this area. We only get one shot. We need to use that shot for an approach that we have some basis to believe will actually work. We know that in addition that in this particular period when we're still in the midst of a systemic financial crisis on both a U.S. and global scale, that the prospect of creating out of nothing trillions of dollars, literally, in new financial instruments that will be immediately subject to derivatives and derivative markets. At a minimum, the cost of the commissions and the speculation will be captured in the overall cost of the permits and passed on in higher energy prices. So at a minimum, the American people will be paying for the commissions of financial institutions and the profits of the speculators. At the worst, adding $1 trillion in new financial instruments and untold $1 trillion in the derivatives of those financial instruments introduces another layer of risk in, I might note, a market subject to enormous volatility in prices, which is what drives the speculation and we have seen reckless behavior by financial institutions. Why would we ever open ourselves to that at this point in time when we have a much more efficient, equal, and I believe not only economically efficient but transparent and democratic and at least as environmentally effective approach as cap and trade. I think the only reason we would is because, we're dealing right now with a certain legacy cost from the political debate. And let me say, in the early 90s, when cap and trade was first being discussed on a large scale by economists, I thought, gee, that's kind of an interesting approach. Looks market-based, which was its attraction to the environmental community in order to kind of enter into the larger policy debate at a time when not many people took the underlying problem very seriously. But the fact is that within a year or two, most economists were able to identify certainly the economic problems with the cap and trade regime and move to what is the overwhelming consensus among economists for a carbon-based tax system. But my friends in the environmental community, many of them have held on to this. So there is a certain legacy cost. But the fact is we are all equally committed to the same goal. This is simply a process of, or not simply, but it begins with a serious process of public education of all of us, including the environmental community and the business community, which needs to continue to be educated to take serious steps, and the environmental community on the costs and benefits of different approaches to taking those steps. I think that this forum is a great example of that process, and I'm honored to be part of it. Thank you.